pop goes the prospect. Mel Kiper and Field Yates are ready to break down the most electrifying players of the 2026 NFL draft class. That is coming up. Plus, we are responding to your questions, your takes, and your draft dreams live as First Draft starts right now. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to First Draft. Delighted to be with you again, as always, live on the NFL on ESPN YouTube channel, on ESPN2, wherever you get your podcasts. They are the legends, Mel Kiper Jr. and Field Yates. I am Greeny. We are delighted to be back. A reminder that from now through the new year, First Draft is with you every Wednesday at noon Eastern on the NFL on ESPN YouTube channel, later on ESPN2 that day. And to catch up on any of the episodes you missed this season, you can scan the QR code on your screen and access the entire First Draft YouTube playlist. We're going to dive into some of the players that pop for Field. We're going to dive into a matchup that Mel has circled this weekend, basically because a lot of NFL teams and a lot of NFL scouts have circled it. But before anything else, I like to take people behind the scenes. Mel, when I logged on to record this edition of today's podcast, I couldn't help but notice that you and Field were going through Field's hair with a fine-tooth comb, if you will excuse the expression. And you know, there's nothing I love more than Field's hair. What was it we were looking for there?
I'm looking for grays because I got some, so I'm going to trade some grays and send them to Field for some of those dark hair that Field has and send it this way, and maybe we can do some surgical work to get these grays out of here permanently, Field. But you are looking sharp, man, and no haircut required for Field and Yates based on what we've seen today.
Yeah, Greeny, there have been some negotiations that have not risen to the level that Adam Schefter is reporting on them, but there have been some negotiations about a potential haircut coming up soon. I felt like when I was leaning into the screen, you could check me for lice. So I'm sure America doesn't want to see my hair that up close and personal, but it's nothing if not a conversation starter.
Well, I can't speak for America, but I sort of enjoy it myself. One way or the other, we'll see. You've got no gray, Mel has a few grays, and mine we won't talk about because who knows if it's real or not. Okay, let's dive in here. We're going to do some players who pop. Last week we did the 5 things you need to know. Today we're going to do some players who pop and a matchup that will decide a lot when we get to April. Field, let's start with you. Who's the first player who is popping off your screen?
Yeah, so Greeny, we came into this season with this collection of quarterbacks that we thought had a real chance to make a run at the first overall pick in the draft. And we were focusing on a lot of the top tier guys. Of course, the names people know, Arch Manning and Cade Klubnik and Drew Aller and Garrett Nussmeier. Up to this point, and we're only 3 weeks into the college football season, that group is probably underwhelmed as opposed to further secured or stamped their status as the top quarterbacks in college football that are eligible for next year's draft. But there was a player kind of on the outside looking in, John Mateer, who maybe it's something about transferring from Washington State to a bigger program the following year, because Cam Ward goes from Washington State to Miami and becomes the number 1 pick in the draft. I don't know how likely number 1 pick in the draft is for John Mateer yet, but the former Washington State quarterback is a huge part of Oklahoma's success. They're now ranked 11th in the AP poll. They have a big game this weekend we'll dive into in just a little bit. Let's talk through some of the sort of the strengths and limitations for John Mateer. I think the limitations probably easier to get to because they're, to this point in the season, Greeny, not very many of them. Not a big quarterback. 6'1", 224 pounds. What I was told Oklahoma's internal measurements were. He's listed at 6'1", 225 on ESPN.com. So a rare situation where a player is actually honest about his measurements on the roster. So not great size, but not 5'10" or 11. We're not back into the Kyler Murray, Bryce Young territory about height and weight. On top of that, a little bit of a riverboat gambler sort of mentality in his game. Couple of interceptions this season where probably would have liked to take those throws back, but in some ways that riverboat playing on the edge mentality is also a big strength of John Mateer's game because he's got moxie. I've used that term describing some of the other quarterbacks so far this season, but he has a fearlessness. There is a never say die on any given play for John Mateer that has really stood out. He's got very good arm strength. He is definitely an innovator. He's got some good rushing ability as well. And from everything that I have been told, on top of the stuff that you see on the tape, I think we're reminded more and more and more as every year goes by how important the wiring of a quarterback is. Do you have it between the ears? And everything I've been told about John Mateer, the player, is that he's the kind of guy that's relatable to the entirety of the locker room. The kind of guy whose devotion to the game is sort of the kind of stuff that it galvanizes the rest of the locker room as well. So to me, there's a lot of good that we have already seen from John Mateer that I think has at least put him into the conversation of quarterbacks that you must know going into next year's draft. He still has more eligibility beyond this year, but he went from more off the radar or on that sort of outside looking in to very much in the conversation of quarterbacks that deserve to be talked about every single week.
Talk about entertaining, and that's what we want to be. We want to be entertained when we watch a college game or an NFL game because we're not fans of every team, right? When we turn a game on, who's going to be a guy that, man, you just got to watch. Just kind of, you've got to be riveted to the screen, right? And that's John Mateer because he can do things, Greeny and Field, in ways that no other quarterback can. Yep. And some of the jump throws, some of the things he does, some of those magical throws, and some of those just wow throws. And you say, boy, how did he see that? Why did he do that? But he did it. And he did things that nobody else has done. So Josh is 6'5", 240. Mateer, Field says 6'1", 225, whatever he is. Doesn't matter. He can run. He had, 800-plus yards rushing at Washington State. This is a kid who can beat you with his legs. He will make any throw. He's fearless throwing the football. Accuracy at times will wane a little bit, like he's improving in that area mechanically. But he's always going to be off a little bit, as Mahomes was coming out, because of all different arm angles. When I say off some throws, you'll say, why? Patrick did it. Certainly Josh did it, and now we have John Mateer doing it. And I think he has rocketed up draft boards, no question about that. Red River rivalry's coming up. Big games coming up in the future. Already played that Michigan defense. Washington State, you talk about the connection. Now he's at Oklahoma. But I went back to 79 when Jack Thompson was one of the first guys I evaluated. Then you got Mark Rueben, you got Bledsoe, and all these Washington Rosendahl, all these Washington State quarterbacks. What's the deal there? Cam Ward, Washington State, then certainly at Miami. But Mateer is a guy, along with Fernando Mendoza, the Indiana quarterback, who cupcakes have been, like you said, it's a sugar high for a lot of these players because they're
sure is. Yeah.
But Mendoza's done it. You can only do 75%, 9 touchdowns, no picks. He was 19-20 against Indiana State.
The first half. Yeah.
Against Air is tough to do that, okay?
Yeah.
So when you talk about the schedule coming up for Mendoza, you got Illinois, Iowa, Oregon. So now you get the main course. Forget the entree, the cupcakes before you get the entree. Went kind of backwards on that, but the bottom line is the competition gets tougher, and that's when the evaluation of Fernando Mendoza will pick up. But right now, he's a guy people are watching very closely because of the accuracy. He's only been sacked once. Was sacked a lot of Cal. Well, he's had 1 sack so far. Does he continue to get the ball out quickly when his opponents get a lot tougher?
Greeny, if I may, just to put a final word on John Mateer, and I have a lot of thoughts on Mendoza as well, who has looked the part through 3 games for Indiana. They have a big game on Saturday against Illinois. At this juncture, as we know, it's very, very early in the process. One of my first filters is wow plays. How many wow plays do you have in a positive fashion? How many wow plays do you have in a negative fashion? Because the negative fashion plays are the ones that push you down the draft board, right? The wow plays in a negative fashion have worked against Arch Manning early on this season. Mateer has had quite a few wow plays in the positive fashion and very few in the negative fashion, which is why I think he's become a bigger part of this conversation.
Absolutely. And we mentioned the game earlier, Mel, but the whole world saw him play Michigan, right? These standout games for people who aren't draft analysts like you guys are. So I'm just watching the biggest games of the week. Mateer already had that, and I think he opened a lot of eyes. A lot of people, like myself included, all of a sudden found myself saying, holy smoke. Like, are we moving into an area where now we need to be having a conversation about him? There's always a player or two like that each season. Candidly, last year it was Jaden Daniels, or 2 years ago it was, and we all saw what wound up happening there. Okay, so we've got some quarterbacks, always the most interesting position. Mel, let's talk about a game now, rather than a player who pops. But there was one game that you were going to suggest this week that every team in the National Football League will have an eye on. What's that game, and what's the reason?
Matchups galore. Texas Tech at Utah. Texas Tech kind of did this year what Ole Miss has done. They go heavy into the portal. They're sinking a lot of money, getting players, getting prospects. So Texas Tech at Utah. Utah has 2 bookend offensive tackles. Fielding had him in his mock draft. Talk about Caleb Lomu, the left tackle. Spencer Fano, the right tackle. Now, Spencer Fano was the left tackle the first year when Lomu redshirted, okay? But when Lomu got back to 100% and was ready to go, he was the left tackle. So Fano moved to right tackle, where he's been last year and now this year. Caleb Lomu mirrors so effectively, okay? Stunts, twists, don't bother this kid. They rushed for 311 yards against Wyoming. Very impressed with that game. I want to see him against Texas Tech. Why? Fernandoz and Lobo. This game so important. Romello height came well traveled. Okay, looking about Auburn, USC, Georgia Tech. Led Georgia Tech in tackles for loss. Now he's at Texas Tech, kind of wreaking havoc. Okay, I saw him on a wheel route, cover it back down the field. He's getting after the quarterback. He is relentless. He's got spin moves. He's got inside-outside moves. Romello White and David Bailey, who came from Stanford in the portal. So you got David Bailey had a sack last week as well. Bailey and Height for Texas Tech coming off the edge against Lomu, who's at left tackle, and Fano, who's at right tackle. That Texas Tech-Utah game, a lot of NFL evaluation eyes from scout standpoint are going to be in that game on that matchup. That's one heck of a matchup where you get four guys going up, and that's what you want. That's what the Senior Bowl is, 101 field. That's what we watch, right? That's everybody's gearing towards. You get them in this game, which is a rarity because normally it's the AOGs against a great player. No, these aren't AOGs. These guys are going to be, all four of these guys are playing in the NFL, and we know those two bookends are going very high. And Height and so far Bailey, particularly Height, is off to a great start getting after the quarterback.
There's so many games that I have breezed through up to this point of the season. My next player of the pop is actually a good example of somebody where you're putting some stock into it, but you got to be careful because of the competition. It's so great to kind of get into the heart of the college football schedule, which not that the beginning of conference play is a guarantee to have top tier games, but certainly when SEC conference play and Big Ten conference play is in the thick of it, we have a lot more matchups that actually matter. I think back to the past couple of drafts and rewatching Texas and Alabama probably 50 times last year, and Texas and Michigan last year. Quinn Ewers going up against that really, really strong Michigan defense. There have been so few players that have had exposures against great prospects that I'm pumped for what's ahead on the schedule here. And I'll just mention Spencer Fano. That to me, of the two Utah tackles, is the higher upside player. Mel, I think you probably are on the same boat on that one. Yep. Interesting to see where his length checks out. I'm not going to try to introduce arm length conversations too early on into our first draft season here, but as we know, it can become a defining characteristic for a player's value, as was the case with Will Campbell last year. Good enough to go 4th overall, or is he more like the 12th overall pick in the draft? One of the things to watch with Spencer Fano, who may not have these, Ronnie Stanley 35.5-inch arms.
All right, so on we go back to Field and his players who draft, and or pop. And as I mentioned, we get your tweets and X posts and questions and all that sort of stuff every week. We love responding, and I have one from Devil Duck. You know we love Devil Ducks.
Yeah.
Devil Duck tweets, Dante Moore is QB1 in this year's NFL draft. Field, is he one of those players who pops for you?
No question about it. He's breathed some life into this draft class. We've already talked about it a little bit earlier. We dove into John Mateer. Dante Moore has been excellent as well. He came into college with plenty of pedigree. He's a Michigan kid who went to UCLA. I think he was the number 2 player in the ESPN 300, 5-star on top of 5-star. Spends a year at UCLA, backs up Dylan Gabriel at Oregon last season, which means he's now a full-time starter at Oregon, but also draft eligible next season. Everybody talks about, fairly, I believe, Dylan Raiola and how at Nebraska he has this aesthetic, Greeny, that looks like Patrick Mahomes. Even if his play is, no one can be Patrick Mahomes in terms of play. For those that haven't watched much of Dante Moore, and they have played the cupcake schedule through the first 3 games of the season, things will fatten up for them a little bit. They play Penn State just around the corner. That'll be great. Dante Moore has a little bit of the aesthetic, make that clear, the aesthetic of Jaden Daniels. Wears number 5, similar helmet, wiry build. He's 6'3", 206 pounds, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the exact measurement that LSU had for Jaden Daniels coming out. Remember, Jaden Daniels didn't even weigh in at the combine when he went there a couple of years ago, along with his teammate Malik Neighbors. Hasn't mattered much. Dante Moore is not nearly the athlete of Jaden Daniels, not nearly the scrambler of Jaden Daniels, but he has been throwing the football all over the yard. The downfield accuracy has been very, very good from Dante Moore. Really, the full field accuracy has been really good for him. They've just given like a little dash of some of his rushing so far, but it has not been much of a factor whatsoever. Now, he is thin. He is rail thin, is Dante Moore. So keeping him away from gigantic hits is going to be a big, big point of emphasis, not just for Oregon, but for wherever he ends up in the NFL. But the early returns for Dante Moore as Oregon starter have absolutely caught my attention, Mel. A guy who he'll be more battle tested soon enough, especially against Penn State. But he has moved himself from the not really on the radar to you better have me be a part of this conversation.
Yeah, no question. And I think the opponents have allowed him to kind of settle into this game, the college game. And after the struggles he had at UCLA, and Will Stein, that coordinator, has done a great job with him. But I think another year, even if he finishes this year and he's great, that's just 1 year as a starter. You don't want that number to be that low coming out. So go back to Oregon for another season. You know the talent's going to be around you. Kenyon Sadiq could move on. Doesn't matter. You're going to have talented kids coming into that program every year. Mekhi Hughes comes from Tulane. Every rushes for almost 1,500 yards in back-to-back years, and he's not even the guy. There's 3 or 4 backs that are leading the charge ahead of Mekhi Hughes who thought, hey, I'm going to Oregon. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be a star. And it hasn't happened after 2 great years with the Green Wave at Tulane. So sometimes the portal doesn't treat you that well. In the case of Mekhi Hughes, he's not getting the carries other guys are in that talent-laden running back room for the Oregon Ducks.
It's a fascinating situation there. I just saw them play against my beloved Northwestern Wildcats in a game that was not nearly as close as the final score would indicate.
Brady, I'd be curious. Was your impression very favorable of Dante Moore? I know you always say I'm not an analyst, but you know ball, and you've had guys over the past couple of years that you're like, wow, and you were not wrong.
No, these guys are coming out of nowhere. It's a fascinating the way I feel like this thing is evolving. The closer I come to it. So up until several years ago, I followed the draft just as a fan of primarily pro and then secondarily of college football. Then I started hosting the draft on ESPN with Mel and Lewis and Booger and company. And so I started paying much closer attention as the season would go on. Now that I'm in here in sort of in the trenches of it every week with you guys, I'm very much attuned to the fact that the things we expect to have happen are not the ones that do. Like the surprises, like these are not the names that we thought we'd be talking about. You guys launched a few weeks before I came on board, but even when I started a couple of weeks ago, these were not the names I anticipated us talking about. What is the cause of that, Mel? Why is it that suddenly we're talking about guys 3 weeks into the season that we were not even mentioning in the initial episodes of the podcast?
Well, I think a lot of the transfers, they're adapting and kind of figuring it all out with new players around them. And a lot of these quarterbacks are doing the exact same thing. And some of the guys, like Cade Klubnik, thought he had Antonio Williams was going to go to receiver. He's been hurt since the first game. Didn't play this past week against Georgia Tech. So then you have guys trying to figure. That's why I'm impressed with Mateer. He had to come in and figure it out, but he brought with him Ben Arbuckle, who's the coordinator, has been with him. So he brought that offense with him, to the Norman campus and Norman, Oklahoma. The bottom line is familiarity is important. Getting on the same page with some of these guys is critical. Mendoza's done it against Cupcakes. Let's see what happens against Illinois, then Iowa, then Oregon, right? So you want to see these guys. You don't evaluate guys against the lesser competition. You want to see good against good. And we're starting finally. Now we get into the latter portion of September, right? We should be back at school. We're going to be back at school. We're going to be watching these guys and seeing how they do against this elite competition. That's why I pointed out the Texas Tech game against Utah, because we're getting that. And we've seen guys, though, pop. And Fields mentioned a lot of those guys. I have a couple more to the pop. So I only really care about how guys do against good teams. And if they did it this year so far, but they did it last year over the course of the season, then you're excited. But you got to see guys where, like I say, good versus good.
Yeah, Greeny, a big test coming up for Dante Moore. Not this weekend. They are 35.5-point favorites.
This guy does with the whiteout, right?
Yeah, against Oregon State. But Penn State on the road, that'll be a gigantic matchup. And then the following week, Indiana, who, the strength of Indiana in the eyes of NFL evaluators is, of course, their quarterback. But still, a good roster that Curt Cignetti has once again assembled out there in Bloomington.
Yeah, so as the weather gets colder, and these matchups get better, and we'll start to figure out more about these guys. I'll just say, if you had told me a month ago that we were going to be spotlighting when it comes to quarterbacks, John Mateer and Dante Moore in the middle of September, I would have taken that as a surprise, but I'm delighted for them. It's the beauty of the sport. Okay, Mel, let's go back. We're talking about players who pop. Let's talk about a defensive player who has caught your eye.
Yeah, you think about the USC Trojans, and you look at where they are right now defense. Eric Gentry, and this guy was really a guy who popped over the course of a couple seasons. And you look at him, I always call him splendid splinters, right? Big Ted Williams fan. Remember, Devontae Smith was splendid splinter, right? Coming out of Alabama. on a defense, Eric Gentry, you don't see guys, they got him at 6'6", and I buy that. What's his weight? 220, 225. He's got the frame once he gets in the league to put on some pounds to that frame, but he is instinctive linebacker who finds the football, whether it's getting after the quarterback, whether it's chasing down running backs with great lateral quickness, okay? Whatever you're asking him to do, he's able to get it done and at a high level. He almost intercepted a pass against Bree, went through his hands, ended up being a touchdown the other way this past Saturday. He leads them in tackles, he leads them in sacks. This kid pops. Eric Gentry, who they shade inside, play him outside, gives you that versatility. By the way, Rex Ryan, right? Twin brother Rob Ryan. Rob Ryan is the linebacker coach at USC. Rob Ryan is working with Eric Gentry. And I'm going to be talking to Rob about Eric Gentry because I look at him and I get a kid, the versatility fielding that he has, the production in all three key areas of linebacker play, and he's done it over a period of time, not just this year. He's already proven he can get it done. Gentry just finds the ball. And when you watch a game, he shows up at key moments. I've liked what I've seen so far of Eric Gentry, linebacker at USC.
But Mel, can I just ask a quick question about the measurables on a guy like Gentry? Because
Sure.
we live in a world now where with quarterbacks, sometimes we're willing to throw out the measurables, right? Well, he's not 6'3", but he has all these other intangibles. I always go back to Bill Polian. I think I've told you this story before, but one year we were going out to do the draft before I was the host, but we were just doing Mike and Mike from the draft at Chicago. And I had the extraordinary good fortune of being seated next to Bill Polian on a plane from Hartford, Connecticut to Chicago. And I just got to pick his brain for 2 hours. And if there's one thing I always remember about that conversation, he said, Greeny, if you go outside the box, the measurables sort of create a box. If you go outside the box, it doesn't mean it could be a great player, but you're definitely going out on a risk. Inside that box is where overwhelmingly history tells you want to remain. So my question is, you have a 220-pound kid who plays linebacker. What does that translate to, Mel, on the next level?
What Bill was saying is outlier. And Bill screamed at me a lot about all this stuff. And outlier, I remember hearing outlier a lot out of Bill's mouth. And it's right. You don't draft outliers. He was set on what you needed to do, whether you were a defensive end coming off the edge. You think about the speed you needed, the 40 time you needed, whatever it was, don't deviate. It's tempting to deviate. It's tempting to go for an outlier because you're looking at him because he was an outstanding player in college, but don't go there. Gentry to me, and I grew up with Jack Lambert. I grew up with the steel curtain. Jack Lambert was, 215 pounds, but playing behind Joe Green, Joe Green, right? And that steel curtain. Eric Gentry, protect him. He's 220, 225. He has that frame to add some weight once he gets into the NFL to that frame at 6'6". But the way he plays, and they shade him inside to the outside, to me, he's just too productive, and he's too consistent. And like I said, I'll be speaking to Rob Ryan. Rob and Rex in the NFL forever. Buddy, late great Buddy Ryan, one of the best friends ever in the National Football League, one of the greatest defensive minds in the history of this game, right? Rex and Rob followed in Buddy's footsteps. Rob's been around a lot of great players. He's with Eric Gentry. I'm anxious to see what he has to say about him as the season moves along.
Okay. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see. These sort of larger philosophical questions are a great learning opportunity, I think, not just for me, but I think anyone who loves and is interested in the draft. All right, let's get some more players who pop. We have a tweet here from @4thAndWrong. Field tweets at us. He gives you three options. Okay. Who should the Titans draft number 1 this year? Caleb Downs, Peter Woods, or Keldrick Falk is the third name that he mentions. One of those is a player who was jumped off the tape at you.
Yeah, I mean, probably the answer is all of them have jumped off the tape. We've talked about Caleb Downs a decent amount. I think he's the best prospect in the class right now. And we're having this conversation on September 17th, people. So if a month from now, a quarterback has emerged and looks like the absolute real deal and the best player in the draft, we'll reevaluate. That's why this process takes many months, not just a few games, to decide who goes first and who doesn't go first. But I want to talk about Peter Woods for a second here from Clemson. And I think that we need to, this is almost like setting the table for what is ahead during the pre-draft process for Peter Woods here, Mel and Greeny. Peter Woods' numbers are probably going to be pretty average throughout the course of this year in terms of sack production. He had 3 in 2024. He's not going to be this guy that racks up 12.5 sacks, most likely. That being said, if there is a better pot stirrer on defense in this year's draft class, I'd like to find it. A guy who just every single play is making life uncomfortable for usually multiple offensive linemen, but at least one. We're talking about a rare combination of power, explosion, quickness, instincts, and vision to just take the play and maybe knock it 25% off its intended design. It does not mean a ton of sacks, may not necessarily mean a million solo tackles. He makes life easier on every player around him on that Clemson defense. And obviously Clemson has had a terrible start. They're now 1-2. They've been the biggest disappointment, I would argue, in college football. That being said, a guy who during the pre-draft process will be in the top 5 pick consideration may not have numbers that make your eyes pop. He has been unbelievable so far this season. Such an incredible disruptor.
He gets a lot of attention along that interior, and there's no question. And to mention the disappointment that Clemson is, the Georgia Tech game, you got to find a way to win that football game now. Even if you run the table, what happens to Clemson, the Tigers? I thought they were one of the top 3-4 teams in college football. They've been anything but. Injuries have affected it. But this gets back to, you talk about philosophy, Greeny, the philosophy of Dabo. Dabo is not a portal guy. Will Helt's come in, though. You mentioned Peter Woods and also Parker, but Will Helt, disruptive again against Georgia Tech. He's been a guy coming from Purdue who's done a really good job. You got to get 4 or 5 guys every year. You really have to. And that provides you with depth. Antonio Williams, outstanding wide receiver, out. And now all of a sudden, Wesco had a big drop in that game. Had some good catches, but a key drop. You don't have the depth of talent, particularly the skill spots, that wide receiver spot for Klubnik, to allow you to keep going when a guy gets hurt, where other teams have those guys. They've got Oregon. They get a transfer, supposed to be great. They got other guys that are right now playing ahead of him. Clemson has to, I think, go away from that, hey, we're going to be Albuquerque for the Dodgers, that farm system. We're going to develop our guys. We're going to be loyal to our recruits and not go bring somebody in for 1 year. Go get 4 or 5 guys to kind of augment your roster, and that might be the way to go for Dabo moving forward, because right now, this year, it just didn't work. And you thought it would. I thought it would. I drank the Kool-Aid. I was a big on Clemson. So far, they've been a huge disappointment.
Not sure how much that will impact the draft stock of some of their best players, but we will see. So there's one defensive tackle, Field, who has popped off the tape at you. How about another? I know there's another you have your eye on.
Yeah, defensive tackle-wise, Amari Washington from Oregon, Oregon, like Georgia, Ohio State, Penn State, Alabama, you have a guy who has to wait his turn and hardly even plays the year prior, and then all of a sudden you're watching him in his first season as a full-time starter, and you're saying to yourself, my gosh, how do they keep this guy off the field? Again, Oregon's schedule has been extremely light early on this season, but Amari Washington, who might be a true nose tackle in the NFL, has a slightly stouter build, is quick, he is powerful, he is pushing interior offensive linemen left and right. I acknowledge that the competition, especially in the first 2 weeks, I think it was Montana State and
Oklahoma State,
who they won by like 60 points. Oklahoma State is obviously in a down season right now under Mike Gundy. But Amari Washington, Greeny, when I'm thinking about these interior defensive linemen, I'm looking for the guys who obviously have the build, the strength, and the power, but the agility as well to play behind the line of scrimmage. There are certain schemes in the NFL where teams are going to simply value guys who disrupt behind the line of scrimmage. The 49ers are always an example I think of. If you're just one of those guys who holds steady and does a good job of making life easier for somebody behind you, it's going to be less appealing. They're looking for these attackers. I think Amari Washington has shown early on this season, albeit against lighter competition, that he's got some of that attack mentality. He has definitely stood out. And a reminder that just because you don't start 1 year does not mean you don't have a lot of talent, because this guy's patience has really paid off for Oregon.
Yeah, that's September 27th game, guys. That's the game. That's Oregon at Penn State. That's the whiteout. It's Dante Moore's opportunity. That's Kenyon Sadiq. That's all those Penn State
Drew
guys.
Allers.
Forced by Drew Aller. That's everybody, because that's the spotlight game. That's the whiteout game. That's going to be huge. Talk about crowd noise. Talk about the entertainment value, the environment of college football, and I don't care if you're a fan of Oregon or Penn State or not. Yeah. You're going to be watching that game, and like from a scouting standpoint, so many good players going up against each other in that game, September 27th at Happy Valley.
No question. A quick philosophical one for you, Mel. Yeah. Defensive tackles, with the way the game has evolved and the way quarterbacks are as mobile as they are and doing the different things they're doing, that pressure up the middle, that pressure directly in their lap, that feels like the emphasis, if that's the right word, on that position has increased exponentially. Do we have that right?
Hugely. And it always has been. It always said, what do they always say? A quarterback's the great ones say, what affects me more? Not the outside pressure, the interior pressure. And that's where you have to have it. The days of the stay-at-home defensive tackle are just about over. Now, you got to handle the run, but you got to stop the run on the way to the quarterback. So that ability to have that quick, explosive defensive tackle that can get into the backfield, and going back to the Warren Sapp days and guys like that, is what you need. Aaron Donald, those types of guys. The word is disruptive. You got to be disruptive no matter where you're playing up front, and particularly at defensive tackle now.
Yeah, I would just add to that is when a player applies pressure off the edge, that's a good thing. But quarterbacks have a little bit more real estate to work with, right? You can find your way backwards and retreat to the sideline and scramble. You can step up into the pocket and find your way out. There's just fewer options for a quarterback when you've got someone bearing down the middle of the pocket. It's usually retreat, where your footwork gets all jacked up.
It totally does. Off your spot and your eyes drop. Okay.
Even some of these athletic guys, even the good ones, the Lamars, the Joshes, the Jalen's, the Patrick Mahomes, like it's just harder for them to counterpunch guys coming right down the barrel. And that's why I think that some of these defensive tackles will go very high after a great defensive tackle class this past season.
Resetting for quarterbacks, you see it in the NFL. Once they drop those eyes, they lose sight of what's out there. They have regressions, forget it. And then all of a sudden you're not going through your primary. Now you got to go kind of reset, kind of figure it out again, and then things break down and your completion percentage drops dramatically.
Yep, agreed.
All right, let's do one more then. So having just sort of sung the praises of the interior defensive lineman, Fields' last player who pops is one of those edge rushers from the year.
Yeah, Rueben Bain from Miami, a player who has been incredibly impactful so far this season. He had an interception in the game against Notre Dame where he showed not just the ball skills to bring the football in, which is not a guarantee for these guys who often play with a hand in the dirt, but also the vision and the instincts to track the play and get out there in space and make that play. Rueben Bain, I don't think relative to some of these top, certainly not to an Abdul Carter level of athletic ability. He's not super sudden, gonna win with his first step and just beat the quarterback to wherever he is going to drop before the quarterback even gets there. He is powerful though. This guy's just got thick, powerful agility, ability to just run right through offensive tackles. He is an absolute locomotive coming off the edge and has been really impressive. He was obviously very, very good last year for Miami as well. The question I had was, can he win not just with just sort of taking advantage of lesser offensive tackles, which was not the only reason why he won last year. I wanted to see a little bit more nuance to his game this season, and we have seen it. This player ended up going in the second round, but Mel reminds me a little bit in terms of sort of the complete package, despite this like thicker, bulkier frame of what we saw from Nick Scourton at Purdue 2 years ago. A guy who was maybe not super long, elite first step, but just got home consistently with power and hand usage. Scourton goes in the second round. I don't know that Rueben Bain's going in the second round at this point. He looks like a first-round pick so far this season, but a player that definitely has shined for Miami, who is now all the way up to number 2 in the country, and Carson Beck has been rock solid for them as well so far this year.
Let me say this, and Grady, you want to watch a guy who's going to impress you for the draft, watch Rueben Bain Jr. He's healthy now. Field talked about last year. I kind of throw last year out. Field, he had the hamstring, and he missed some games, and he wasn't healthy. He even said, hey, football's now fun again, because he knows he can play to the level of his talent and the level of his ability each and every week, and he's exactly done that each and every week. He's been a guy who hustles like no other. Nobody chases. No defensive lineman in the country works as hard as this kid to get ready for a game as Rueben Bain Jr. does. And once the game kicks off and we start it, he doesn't quit on a play. His stamina, his endurance, his rip move is phenomenal to watch. He's got bend. He's leading them in tackles. That tells you about production. That tells you about, hey, just all-out hustle. And guess who's coaching him? Okay? We're talking about Rob Ryan coaching Eric Gentry at USC. Jason Taylor is coaching Rueben Bain Jr. And Jason Taylor says, hey, I'd like to get out of the building at some point in time. Rueben Bain Jr. won't let me leave because he's asking question after question. So this is the kind of kid, from a talent standpoint, okay, production. What's the production? He's got the ability. He's healthy, okay? Yeah. Got a hamstring. He played through it last year, okay? Go back to his first year, his freshman year, 7.5 sacks, 12 and a half tackles for loss. He's the top young defensive lineman in the entire country in that conference in the ACC. Now he's healthy and he's wreaking havoc again. And because he doesn't quit, he's over-intercepting a pass. He's he's doing things because he chases and he hustles on every single snap that he's involved in. Rueben Bain Jr. is going to go pretty high. Until everything's over, I'm not going to jump to any conclusion at how high. He's a first-round player. He's probably a high first-rounder after all said and done. And he's playing as well as any defensive end in college football right now. Watch him. Watch this kid at Miami. Yeah. Don't lose sight of him because every play, there's something that he's going to do that's going to make you go, wow.
Mel, you like this edge class so far this season?
Yeah. And I think the guys that we're waiting to see come along are still out there. But the guys that have, I mentioned last week, Will Help at Clemson coming in from Purdue. We've seen Rueben Bain get back to 100%, which he is. So again, I think they asked Jason, I was reading an article, they said, well, last year he was hurt. So I think we always have to look at that Field and Greeny. When you watch a player that doesn't perform to the level, you got to say, we say it about, are they hurting a little bit? Because it affects how you play. I mean, if you're not going to factor that in, then you're crazy. Because when you see him at 100%, you say, well, he's going to have to play at less than 100%. Yeah, they will play. He was out there playing. But a hamstring is an issue. So again, now we get a kid like this healthy. And then we talk about the versatility that you provide. And then you talk about the attitude and the approach. I'm a big Rueben. I didn't know Field had him. I was going to start with it. So I audibilized the way for my initial thought about Rueben Bain Jr. because going in, he was the guy number one on my sheet after this past Saturday's games.
He's been excellent. I think this year's rush class, edge class, there is not, in my estimation, through 3 weeks, feel like a Bosa brother or an Abdul Carter level prospect. A guy that you're saying to yourself, without question, no matter how the draft shakes out, he's going in the first, 3, 4, 5 picks. But there are a lot of really intriguing players, and there's just a lot of players in general. There's a good depth at this edge rushing position, even if there may not be one of those guys that we bring in and we immediately expect to be 10 or 12 sacks, Aiden Hutchinson type prospect. I don't think we have that in this year's draft class, but there is a lot of depth.
Yeah, Gabe Ackus at Illinois is going to try to get after Fernando Mendoza. We said
baby, year, how good has Gabe been?
Quarterback, and it took too many sacks, right? Yep. Well, he's only had one this year, one sack, but that was against lesser competition. Now you got Illinois with Gabe Ackus coming off the edge, number 17. Watch him. I mentioned Romello Height, the 2 Texas Tech kids playing against Utah, because and David Bailey. Height has come on. Yeah, well-traveled. Auburn, USC, Georgia Tech, and now at Texas Tech. He's gained momentum.
Years. Oh my God!
Yes, I mean you're talking about guys that weren't Greeny on the big radar, the first round mocks. You didn't see Romello Height's name mentioned, right? Yeah. You didn't see him. I don't know where you guys had Rueben Bain Field. I don't know where you projected him going in, but Height is a guy certainly is getting attention. Denied Dennis Sutton at Penn State. We talk about that Oregon game. Oregon's got a kid named Isaiah Worlds playing that left tackle spot. What happens there? What's that matchup like September 27th up at Happy Valley, that whiteout game? So again, when we get into October, usually mid-October, I think you get a pretty good handle. We're not to that point yet, so I don't want overreaction Jackson to take place here too much with some of these prospects, but certainly the edge rushers, some guys who were under the radar going in, have now surfaced as guys who are going to compete for, like you say, a possibility in maybe day 2, that second or third round area.
So the 2026 draft class is just starting to round into form. And that's all the time we have for this week. But a reminder, you can scan the QR code that you see on your screen to catch up on all the episodes you may have missed. Please like and subscribe to the podcast and be with us every Wednesday on the NFL on ESPN YouTube channel, on ESPN2, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget, send us your questions using the hashtag FirstDraft for a chance to be featured here on the program. For Mel Kiper and Field Yates, I'm Mike Greenberg. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week.